This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
The paper really arises from two different projects. Firstly, from that work on Beckett and testimony that you mentioned, in the course of which I looked at some of the specifically visual ramifications of debates on unspeakability and the limits of expression. And more recently, a project which is still ongoing on the debts of contemporary installation art to the archive. So it's great to have the opportunity to bring those two things together today, and I hope it will make some sense. My title, Remediating Beckett and the Graven Image, refers to a comment made by Egoyan in the context of his installation Steam Beckett, and this will be my starting point today. Over the course of the month, the digital projection was absolutely constant, but the 35mm image went through a process of decay, through dust that had accumulated, through scratches, through people physically trying to maul the film. So a piece like Steam Beckett is dealing with the relationship of analogue technology and its basis in physical principles of the Graven image, whether it be on silver or through the displacement of oxide on magnetic tape to certain corporeal aspects of decay. I quote that in full because it's quite fundamental to what I'm going to be discussing today. So that's a comment from Egoyan in an interview in 2007. And Egoyan is referring to Steam Beckett, an installation which, as you may well know, was first installed in the former Museum of Mankind building in Burlington Gardens in London in 2002. And it was subsequently remade during the Enniskillen Festival in 2012, and most recently at MAC, the Midland Arts Centre, in Birmingham this year, 2015. So I want to assess just what this corporeal decay is that Egoyan's referring to here, and its significance for some of the recent remediations of Beckett that I'm interested in. And in order to do that, I want to consider the biblical origins of the idea of the Graven image and its implications for some recent and some less recent recording technologies. That's the question that I want to get at. And by discussing some of the ways that Egoyan draws upon Beckett's use of technologies of recording, I want to try to build a larger argument concerning the remediation of Beckett's work as installation art, which I think is quite a broad tendency at the moment, and a tendency in which Egoyan's work plays an important role. So, I'm going to consider Egoyan's Steam Beckett as one of the most striking enactments of embodiment in Beckettian installation art, although certainly not without its complications. Steam Beckett embeds Krapp's tape in concerns with materiality, obsolescence, and more broadly the ontology of the image, which also recall the work of Jean-Luc Godard and some of the debates which have grown up around that work concerning the visual documentation of the Holocaust, as well as revisiting the obsession with memory and archiving in Krapp's last tape itself. So Egoyan refers in that comment to a digital projection, and the digital projection in question is that of Egoyan's version of Krapp's last tape, which he directed in 2000 as part of Beckett on film, and which features in Steam Beckett in both digital and analogue form. So each time that the installation has been made, the digital version has been shown on a large screen, as you can see here, in a room which gives an approximation of a cinema auditorium. But I think it is an approximation. There's a limited amount of seating typically at the back of that room, and the space never quite frees itself from the surrounding identity of the museum or the art space. I think that's part of how it works. So that's the digital projection on a screen which dwarfs the spectator, who sits rather uncomfortably on this bench-type construction at the back. These photographs document the original installation in 2002. The analogue version, though, is shown on the tiny screen of a Steenbeck monitor that you can just about see in the background of this image. And it's accompanied by the massive tape which feeds continually from the machine and through the vast array of reels which dominates this second room. So that's one of the immediate contrasts that the installation sets up. One of the things that's not obvious perhaps from this is the interplay of light and darkness through the tape as it goes through the reels. And one of the things that really struck me looking at the 2015 remaking of this. So, Beckett, I think, suggests that the decay of the analogue film that Egoyan refers to is somehow mitigated, and that it can be mitigated by the preservation of the digital copy, which subsists in near-perfect condition. So the installation is about preservation and loss at the same time, and the suggestion that the image can somehow be preserved beyond the loss, which the piece initially dramatises, is strikingly ambiguous. The work seems to be poised somehow between the suggestion that digital media can reverse the loss inherent within analogue and a kind of nostalgia for conventional film. So you've got this dichotomy here of the digital and the analogue, and there's a lot of nostalgia for the analogue. Now, the piece might suggest a preference for the digital. The digital is the means of recovering or saving the image, but Egoyan's comments complicate this quite significantly. Egoyan equates film, so analogue film, with, I quote, the notion of scarcity and of something having an added value by virtue of the fact that it raises issues of preservation, storage, deterioration and decay. So it's the precariousness of film that makes it precious, or so it appears from Egoyan's comments, of which there are quite a number. There are several interviews in which he expands on these themes at some length. Now, Egoyan also suggests that analogue editing was already on the brink of obsolescence at the time that Beckett was planned, and that it had effectively ceased to be part of his working practices before 2002. So he says, I'm not nostalgic about the ancient technologies of mechanical film splicers, bins of dusty celluloid, and the behemoth that was the editing machine, the mighty Steenbeck. I haven't edited a film on Steenbeck for almost 10 years, but when I was invited to direct a film version of Krapp's Last Tape, I couldn't resist the possible confluence of form, content and process. So there's a case of protesting too much here, I think, claiming not to be nostalgic, saying that analogue film is obsolete, the Steenbeck is no longer current technology, but there's a big but in that sentence, which emphasises something like a really elegiac commemoration of what is a lost medium, or very close to it. So, Egoyan was also to commemorate the reel-to-reel recorder in another installation entitled Au d'usage, Out of Use, the same year as Steenbeck, 2002, and his comments, again, are quite significant for the argument I want to make. It's a call to the community to go into their basements and find obsolete reel-to-reel tape recorders. We've accumulated about 25 so far, mostly from the 60s, and people will come in to recount the last time they recall these machines being used. So this gives us a certain amount of information about Egoyan's investment in tape and in analogue, which intersects very interestingly with the relation of technology to its historical context in Beckett's play, Krapp's Last Tape. In the play, the reel-to-reel machine, far from being obsolete, was pretty much cutting-edge technology at the time of the play's publication in 1958. And it's only really by the time of Beckett's death, in the late 80s, that it was approaching obsolescence at roughly the same pace, I'd suggest, as the Steenbeck was in 2002. So, two different points, if you like, on the timeline that describes the obsolescence of these technologies. And here are some spools. I just couldn't resist showing you that, really. In the context of Krapp's Last Tape, and these are taken from the documentation of Steen Beckett. I believe the tapes originally come from the collection of the Museum of Mankind. Now, I've been talking about obsolescence, and there is a complication to that argument in the way that obsolescence is dramatised in Krapp's Last Tape itself. Krapp's attempts to negotiate the past, of course, are played out in the confines of his den, which closely resembles an archive, and they mainly consist of him listening to old recordings of himself on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. But the paradox of the play is that it depicts, I quote, a late evening in the future. That setting is very significant for what I want to say, and it has far-reaching implications for our view of technologies of recording. This is the play's opening stage direction, and yet it really makes no concrete contribution to the business of staging. Instead, I think it modifies the role of archival technology in the play's reception and in the archive. And it marks Krapp's Last Tape, at least in its textual aspect, with a sign of irreconcilable anachronism. So if we think of the play as a text, the action is embedded in an unspecified future and it's wedded to the technological signifiers of the past, that is, the tape. Now, this is an issue which has come up in relatively recent criticism, including an article by Nicholas Johnson in 2011. Johnson describes the play as now representing, I quote, a fascinating crossroads with profound implications for how Beckett is to be treated in the future. For Johnson, this encounter of future and past represents a practical dilemma, first of all, in the theatre. Johnson argues, writing in the context of the 2010 Gate Theatre production in Dublin, that, I quote, this is the last audience generation for which Krapp could even conceivably be in the present. He can always be read as an old man who held onto a piece of analogue machinery instead of getting a recording attachment for his iPod. But at what point does the technological anachronism get in the way of the play's reception? So, what I'm getting at here is a really ambivalent form of reference to the future, or the idea of the future. And that mode of reference offers a glimpse of a time after Krapp's death, when all my dust has settled, to quote the text of the play, and even later on, towards the end, of a post-human era in which, I quote, the earth might be uninhabited. Now this clearly echoes Endgame and Clove's dream of order in, quoting again, a world where all would be silent and still and each thing in its last place under the last dust. So, there's a discourse of the future here which subtly modifies the play. Although the play can be staged exactly as it's written, the alignment of the tape player with the future, the idea of the future, is unsettling. And it unravels further when we look at the play's archival traces. So, it's been remarked upon a number of times, I think, that Beckett originally planned to set the play in a late evening in the 1980s, but he ultimately decided upon in the future, which complicates things quite significantly, and in terms of this problem of technology that I'm getting at, it has quite significant implications. If it had been set in the 1980s, that would have ensured that the reel-to-reel player looked more and more antiquated to later audiences, but at the same time it would have anchored the action in a specific historical moment and a technological present defined by the fairly recent compact disc and the not yet quite obsolete reel-to-reel machine. But that's not what Beckett ultimately decided. Instead of that, Krapp's Last Tape either suggests a setting in which reel-to-reel technology is itself positioned in the future, so late evening in the future, or perhaps gestures towards the endless succession of recording technologies which supersede it, so that the play, in a sense, resists its own historicisation by occupying a future which always recedes before the spectator's eyes. So there's an unresolved drama of chronology and the asynchronous. There are further aspects to this, I think, in the theatre, and Johnson goes on to discuss the productions of the play staged by Michael Colgan between 2000 and 2010. And he refers to the danger of turning Beckett's plays into what he calls museum pieces. That phrase, though, also literally describes what has happened to the tape recorder used in the Colgan productions. Johnson has quite an interesting argument, I think, here about the mode of repetition and which Colgan pursues and which has potentially serious implications for Beckettian performance. But what I want to argue is that there's something beyond that mode of repetition in the theatre, and that mode has also been the source of some pretty significant opportunities, namely in installation art, which is what I'm going to get on to talk about a bit later on. So, what Egoyan is responding to is the encounter of technology and the material in Krapp's Last Tape, and at the same time the status of that play within Beckett's complex legacy, so the point within that legacy that Krapp's Last Tape now occupies. Some accounts pigeon Krapp's Last Tape as a classic or even as a museum piece itself. But what I'm interested in really is the way that Egoyan embeds that play in contemporary, that is 2002, debates on film and archival technology. So I'm going to come back to that now, and some of these comments that Egoyan has made, which I think really do two things. They redefine the way that we think about technology in the play, Krapp's Last Tape, but they also allow us to think about installation art in ways that I want to try to understand a bit better. So, Emma Wilson asks Egoyan for his assessment of 35mm film in relation to contemporary filmmaking and viewing in an interview. This is in 2010, so almost the same time as the Johnson article. And Egoyan's response sheds considerable light on the idea of an archival medium which has such resonance for Krapp's Last Tape as well. So, Egoyan says, it's supremely impractical talking about 35mm film. There's no question about that. I do think there's something unique about the grain structure when you see an image directly off a negative. It's unworldly. It's so pristine and so arresting. It's lovely, but you can't justify it. There are horrors, seeing a scratched print, bad reel changes, dirt, confusions about the very order in which a reel is to be presented. There's something endearing about that because it speaks to our own bodies and things that we can relate to in terms of things being scratched or damaged or confused. Digital gives clarity, but there's something we're missing. 35mm is sensually the best experience of watching the projected image. So I'm trying to get at this ambivalence that keeps coming out for Egoyan. He starts off by arguing 35mm is impractical, but almost all of that long response is actually concerned with his personal investment in the aesthetics of film, up to the claim, I think 35mm will continue to exist as an archival form. Egoyan claims to prefer digital as a working medium, and in all of the interviews I've looked at, he says that explicitly. And he's also very, if not angry, then perplexed at the decision to show Krapp's last tape in a 16mm print in a Paris screening, and he objects to, well, pretty much everything. The registration, the movement in the frame, the sound, and he claims there's dirt leading to the real change mark. But, at the same time, practical objections are accompanied by nostalgia, and again he says it's touching. So this idea of touching, the materiality that you can touch, is bound up with a form of nostalgia for analogue film, and the link between film and bodily experience. The idea of film as an archival form, I think, is both about obsolescence and a more subtle and more shadowy understanding of the archive and what it might mean. So that's what I'm going to get onto next, and the next part of this paper is entitled Holocaust Representation and the Archive. And what I want to do here is actually consider the resonances of Egoyan's comments on the Graven image with the idea of the image ban and the debate on Holocaust representation which has come to be associated with it. The Graven image, then, suggests both cinematic testimony to atrocity, as we'll see in a minute, and also the mystical idea of the resurrection of the image. I will justify that in a moment. Both contexts originate in the comment's biblical subtext, that is, the ban on pictorial representation in the second commandment. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Since the late 20th century, this ban, or bilderverbot, has come to stand for the claimed impossibility of representing the Holocaust, in particular in visual and filmic form. It's a very problematic claim, but that claim is there. So, as the term suggests, the general claim of the impossibility of representation has a specifically visual dimension, and many of the debates that arise around this problem between Godard and Lanzmann and Didier Huberman and others are really bound up with the existence or alleged non-existence of visual records of the Holocaust. I don't really have time to go into the grounding of those debates here, but they're an important backdrop to the idea of the Graven image I started off with, and also I think there's a connection in Egoyan's work with the representation of atrocity. First of all, though, I want to think about some of the conceptions of the cinematic image in Jean-Luc Godard and André Bazin, and the way that they complicate this debate. So, that 2007 interview, in which Egoyan reflects at length on the implications of digital media for storage, leads him to talk about the working practices associated with digital and the changed conception of the image that results from them. He returns again to the question of archiving, and it's here that the implications of digital media for the idea of the image come to the fore. So again, quite a long statement from Egoyan about what happens in storage. When you transfer knowledge to a hard drive, you are surrendering it to something which is abstract and which is not really accessible through any physical means of which most of us are aware. I think that's a key aspect of this statement. Whereas archiving home movies or any sort of physical negative reminds us at all times of its materiality. Physical negatives then seem to return us to the tactile experience of film, but this rather pejoratively framed surrender of images to the hard drive suggests the loss of the tactile, and possibly a parallel loss in terms of the knowledge and memory which return here in Egoin's account. Now, there may be problems with this, I'm aware, in that writing data to a hard drive does involve an engagement with the material. But what's interesting is the relation to the interviewer, Charlie Kyle's preceding question. He's invited Egoin to reflect on digital practices, and he claims that Egoin's comments for him are reminiscent of André Bazin and his theory of the inherent realism of the cinematic image. So I won't read all of this now. It's a long quotation, but it does pick up on some important aspects of the argument that I've been trying to put together here. Egoin is engaging with Bazin's theory of the cinematic image, and in particular its relation to a rather mystical conception of the image with a capital I. This originates from the idea of the indexical function of cinema, which Bazin grounds in the special status of photographic images. Because the photographic image operates not just through resemblance, but also through the physical imprint of objects on the film, the image is seen, I quote, as a kind of decal or transfer. It doesn't merely simulate real objects, but is infused with the phenomena by which they are constituted. And this is the basis of many later arguments on indexicality. As Bazin pursues the argument in What is Cinema, he reaches rather more extreme conclusions, arguing that the image, I quote, by virtue of the very process of its becoming, is the model. What this leads to is a really strange relation of image and object. Quoting Bazin again, the photographic image is the object itself, the object freed from the conditions of time and space that govern it. It starts to have distinctly metaphysical undertones, this account, suggesting a transcendence of material conditions which elevates the image somehow to another plane. The process by which the image is produced is initially scientifically understood, but leads to a mystical communion of forms. I quote, "The photograph proceeds by means of the lens to the taking of a veritable luminous impression in light." So Bazin uses a number of different figures to describe the cinematic image, the transfer, the mould, the tracing and the imprint, and they all refer to this process of capturing the veritable form of the object. So it's not a relationship of resemblance, it's a direct, indexical, causal relation back to the object. Now, this true form, which Bazin refers to repeatedly, becomes almost a transcendental signifier in his argument, and it recalls the one image which accompanies the text in the original 1945 publication of Qu'est-ce que le cinéma, that of the Turin shroud. The importance of the shroud, like the photographic plate, lies in the formal imprint which it records, in this case, supposedly that of the body of Christ, which has apparently been placed within it. Bazin takes the shroud apparently as a model of the photographic plate, but just as its image occupies an important position within What is Cinema, contemporary accounts, that is contemporary with Bazin, frequently resort to the metaphor of photography. One of these accounts is Pierre Barbet's La Passion de Notre Seigneur Jésus-Christ selon le chirurgien, published in 1950, as later translated as A Doctor at Calvary, the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ as described by a surgeon, and it's a damn good read. So I quote from Barbet, "The marks of blood, which are positive on the negative image of the Redeemer, are, on the contrary, strongly marked and show the characteristics of an impression made by contact. The shroud is described as a negative, and the idea of contact itself is bound up with photographic terminology." So, something quite provocative is going on around the Turin Shroud and contemporary understandings of the photographic image. By the time that Barbet's research was going on in the 1930s, the shroud was commonly being accessed as a photographic image. What's striking in accounts from that time is the limited capacity of photography to capture the referent it supposedly indicates. Photographers like Piat and Giuseppe Enri produced images which, when developed, resembled photographic negatives. So the shroud was the index or trace of something, but that something could only be partially disclosed through the processing of photographic negatives. If processing produced a negative, then photography of the shroud appeals to another absent image situated somewhere else. I'm going to move on now to a film project in which the congruence between Bazin and Egoyan is recontextualized, and hopefully this will allow us to start to move towards installation art once more. So, Histoire du cinéma by Jean-Luc Godard, produced between 1988 and 1998, amplifies the mystical aspect of Bazin's theory of the image, and also, I think, links it to a provocative understanding of history and trauma like that in Egoyan. The memory of bodily presence is bound up with analogue film, and the archive again here. Histoire du cinéma is a really vast, multifaceted work, divided into 8 episodes, but I think one of the real preoccupations of that project is a meditation on cinematic montage. It foregrounds the cinematic procedure of constructing narrative through the juxtaposition of images, and in doing so, it reflects on the history of cinema in the 20th century, and this is the important part for me, on the technology through which cinematic storytelling is achieved. Very often depicts Godard himself using analogue equipment, projectors, and a typewriter whose clacking keys accompany the succession of images, and there are various shots of Godard himself working on the project and generally smoking a cigar. Histoire du cinéma is itself a video project, which complicates things quite a bit. Godard then is drawing upon the preoccupation with the body and its textual incorporations that we've already seen in Egoyan and his views on cinematic technologies. And it recalls Egoyan's position of analogue as a memory which can be contemplated through a digital aperture. So taking digital technologies and looking back at the analogue in a particular kind of way. Okay, so Godard is very interested in this mystical aspect of the Bazinian theory of the image. And I want to just give an example which I think may help tease that out. Jacques Rancière gives a really important account of what Godard is doing in The Future of the Image. And Rancière relates the historical strand of Histoire du cinéma to the following declaration in Godard's voiceover. And if George Stevens hadn't used the first 16mm colour film at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, undoubtedly Elizabeth Taylor's happiness would not have found a place in the sun. So George Stevens was present with the American army at the liberation of Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, and later directed A Place in the Sun. Godard incorporates an image from that film, A Place in the Sun, in which Elizabeth Taylor cradles Montgomery Clift's head in her lap, but he removes it from its narrative context by juxtaposing it with 2 apparently unrelated images, that of corpses at Dachau and of Giotto's Hope. You can see the Giotto reasonably well here, but I haven't been able to isolate the Dachau documentary photograph so well. This is the sequence from A Place in the Sun. This is where Elizabeth Taylor cradles Montgomery Clift's head, and this is the juxtaposition that we see in Histoire du cinéma. So, the idea is that Mary Magdalene's hand is reaching down into this image of Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift here, and that kind of juxtaposition allows a new kind of history to be forged for Godard. As Rancière argues, if Stevens had spent the war as an announcer in New York or a parachutist in Burma, this would ever so slightly have altered the way Elizabeth Taylor, in A Place in the Sun, portrayed the beautiful heiress overjoyed by her idol with the young Rastignac, played by Montgomery Clift. So there's both an engagement with history and, more specifically perhaps, with our view of the Holocaust, which is symbolised by the Dachau images. Okay, now, underpinning all of this, I think there are two things. One of them is technological, a particular take on the image and its technologies. And the other one is the idea derived from André Bazin of the true image, as in Bazin's idea of the luminous impression of phenomena upon the film. So the screen is imprinted then with the image of the real in some sense, according to Rancière. And Rancière compares this to the imprint of Christ's face on Veronica's veil. So it's very reminiscent of the idea of the Turin shroud. The true image, though, enjoys a troubled relationship with technology. Like the Veronica, it's supposed to present an image which is not of human making, which is a divine image in some sense, and which makes possible communion with divine presence. The problem here, and it's quite a big one, is that it's video editing which allows these effects to be achieved. So flash shots and overprinting, and those sorts of techniques are used to point up the juxtaposition of iconic images from 20th century film and religious painting, as in this example. So, this encounter between the image and its technologies and the encounter with a pure presence, according to Rancière, beyond human artifice, lies at the heart of what Godard is doing, and I think it's really there as a subtext in Egoyan as well, and that's what I was trying to get at the beginning of this paper. Beckett, Egoyan and Godard, as we've seen so far, all reflect on the memorial capabilities of film and video technologies and of the passage of those technologies themselves into the archival realm, their passage into obsolescence. But in the years since Beckett's death, I think this question has been redefined, and this reflection on the image and its technologies has been transcribed into the field of installation art, which is what I want to talk about now. So, in the final part of this paper, I want to consider the very broad sense in which Beckett, which I began with, is a remediation of Beckett. And Egoyan's remediation of the play as installation has major implications for how we think about Beckett and how we think about that concern with technology and the material that I've been getting at throughout the paper. Beckett, I think, is not an isolated example, and it points the way, actually, to a very significant body of installation work which responds to Beckett. And one of the things I want to do is simply talk about those installation art projects. Many of them revisit the problem of materiality, technology and the image in ways which are highly germane to Beckett and to what Egoyan does with Beckett. So, okay. I want to try and get to grips with what has been happening in installation art, and this is one account which touches on that problem, although quite indirectly. It's a quotation from Peggy Phelan from The Ends of Performance. Phelan here considers the extended field of the electronic paradigm, and indirectly, by means of that category, she ends up talking about Beckett. She argues that we now entertain a post-relationship to theatre, that is, coming after it. And the strange temporal economy that she identifies here is characterised by, I quote, a series of transpositions, transcriptions, transfigurations. This has huge resonances for me. She continues, our current post signals the difficulty of the end ever arriving at its true ending, or of remaining singular, fixed, gone. And so, like Didi and Gugu, we go on. So this is grist and mill for any Beckett scholar, I think, but it has particular implications for my argument today. The will to end, almost universal in Beckett's work in some form, is counterbalanced in Phelan's account by some form of renewal. And this is a problem that many scholars have come up against in talking about Beckett and performance and technology. I'm just going to take one example of an account which relates the problem of ending to some of the concrete developments in Beckettian performance in recent years. So this is a quotation from Stan Gontarski's 2006 article, Reinventing Beckett. And in the midst of the quotation that I've presented here, Gontarski asked the question, is there a future for Beckettian performance? Can it be reinvented again? And if so, what might such reinvention look like? Now, I'm actually not considering the question of whether Beckettian performance is alive or dead, although there's plenty of evidence for the former. What I'm actually getting at is about the reinvention of Beckett as installation art today. And I'm interested in the underpinnings of that reinvention by real and fantasized materialities and technologies. The question that Gontarski asks, is there a future for Beckettian performance, is answered in part by a strand of experimental work which is marked by the same problem of temporal residuality that's framed by Beckett's own works. So, some examples of that in order to advance this argument a little further. Adriano and Fernando Guimarães are an important part of this body of work, I think, and have remediated Beckett's Breath, the play Breath, a number of times. They implicitly respond to Stan Gontarski's own early installation of Breath, incidentally, which I just want to talk about before I go on to the more recent material. Gontarski's recreation of Breath arose from an event at Florida State University Gallery and Museum in 1992, and he documents this himself in that 2006 article. The main focus of the event was, I quote, the electronic satellite reception of a piece of hypertext poetry by William Gibson, Agrippa, a Book of the Dead. So, this was considered to be the main event on that occasion. Once the hypertext had been broadcast to 9 sites around the world, it was supposed to be destroyed by its own viruses. A limited edition book was also produced, of which you see an image here. The deluxe version of the book came in a heavy, distressed case and was wrapped in a shroud designed to look like some kind of buried relic, and included pages of DNA sequences. It was made up of photosensitive paper and included a copy of a diskette designed for Mac operating system 7. So it's a piece that enacts a kind of dramatically speeded up version of the technological obsolescence that informs Krapp's last tape, and it maybe allows us a kind of technological nostalgia looking back on it today. So Stan Gontarski presented Breath on the same occasion as the Agrippa piece and replaced the proscenium arch of the theatre with, I quote, an oversized prop television, through the absent screen of which Breath would be performed live, if that's the word. Now, this is quite a self-deprecating account from Gontarski. He calls the appearance of the screen clownish, and he claims that the visitors to the gallery must have had difficulty distinguishing it from other objects on display, or from the gallery's refuse outside the service entrance, for that matter. So, self-deprecating, but it does point to something more significant, which I think is the move from the theatre to the gallery, and the dialogue that we get there with the digital. So, the Guimarães brothers revisit the same work, Breath, a number of times, including We Were Not Long Together, and within that, a series of works whose titles include the word Respiração, breath. In Breath More, actors enter water tanks, as you see here, fully dressed, and the short duration of the piece takes on very different undertones in this situation. It's understood now as the period between two breaths. Instead of the span of life, breath stands for a suspension of living processes, the interval between breaths, signalled by a bell, and which threatens to end life. So, some versions of the Guimarães Breath pieces see an actor naked inside a transparent box. He gradually runs out of air, while another actor, who is completely oblivious to his situation apparently, gives an academic lecture on the cultural meanings of breathing. As Gontarski argues, the human is reduced to the machinery of respiration, man or woman reduced to metabolic function. So, works like these replace the invisible body of Beckett's play, Breath, which is indeed reduced to a single function, that of breathing, with the provisionally whole body. And works like these promise a return to the body understood by all of its senses. I think that's quite a significant tendency in recent installation art. It comes up in other work like that of Nikos Navridis, which I won't get onto today. Now, The Lost Ones has also inspired quite a range of installation-based projects, and I'll briefly mention some of these. The first that I've looked at is by Karmin Karasic and is from 1999. And it really exploits some of the problems of scale, epistemology and time, which we see in Beckett's own text, The Lost Ones, Le Dépeupleur. The participants negotiate a real space which also incorporates a virtual world. So you can see physical elements like this shot of the cylinder with model figures within it, but also within the installation space there was a virtual world which of course couldn't be physically entered. Both realms are occupied by a population of searchers. So, this is one take on The Lost Ones. There's another one that I'll briefly mention, which dates from 2008 to 9 by Kenderdine and Shaw, and is entitled Unmakeable Love. In that one, the cylinder environment is created by means of large-scale immersive visualization technology. And both of those Lost Ones-related projects, I think, anticipate Mirosław Bałka's How It Is, from 2009 to 10, seen in the Tate Turbine Hall. So all of these projects testify to the growing move to reimagine Beckett in the form of installation art. That move, I think, is bound up with a certain engagement with embodiment, both in Beckett's work and now in critical writing on installation art. I'll mention one critical account of installation art which makes particular reference to the problem of embodiment as a way just of opening that debate. And this is a comment by Claire Bishop in 2005. Rather than imagining the viewer as a pair of disembodied eyes that survey the work from a distance, installation art presupposes an embodied viewer whose senses of touch, smell and sound are as heightened as their sense of vision. The insistence on the literal presence of the viewer is arguably the key characteristic of installation art. Now, I think this has all kinds of resonance with Beckett's work itself. Not I has got to be one of the most striking sensory interventions, not only in Beckett's work, but much more broadly. Draws the viewer gaze in towards the mouth, the sole illuminated object in the theatre, but highlights the disembodiment of that mouth in a way that's deeply disorientating in the theatre. That work also points the way to Beckett's work in television in the 70s, in which embodiment has a particular stake. And of course, in Beckett's studies, there's work now, including that of Anna McMullen and more recently Trish McTighe, which foregrounds the role that embodied spectatorship has to play. So, what I'm getting at is the recent re-embodiment, if I can put it that way, of Beckett's work as installation art. That re-embodiment, I think, engages actively with some of the epistemological problems of Beckett's later works in particular, and a particular investment in the ontology of the image. So, I'm just going to return to Unmakeable Love, which I mentioned but I don't think I've shown you yet. And this is a mixed reality installation which inscribes the viewer within the installation in a way which both speaks to that multi-sensory embodiment that Claire Bishop works with, but it also reproduces some of the disorientation and confinement which is seen in The Lost Ones. You can see here that a number of spectators are directing torches towards the central cylinder area, which consists of searchers, which are figures created within the virtual world in the centre. And there's an augmented reality effect created when viewers direct the torch not at the bodies of the searchers in the central arena as we see here, but at other viewers who are themselves looking in from the opposite side. So what I'm imagining here is a person in this position directing the torch at another viewer who is outside the cylinder. Now, these torches do not emit light. They simulate pools of light within the virtual environment. Therefore, they shouldn't illuminate the bodies of other viewers in the opposite viewing area. You can bracket off the viewing area outside the cylinder. However, the viewers are themselves being filmed by infrared cameras while in the process of viewing the searchers. So, the illumination of the other viewer, which we see here, is itself a simulation, and one which blurs the boundaries between the real and virtual environments in a highly disconcerting way. I'm very interested in just what's going on at this moment. There's a moment of revelation here in quite a reflexive mode in which the viewer, person holding the torch, is unexpectedly relegated to what he or she may perceive to be an inferior ontological level. So it's like being placed in the cylinder in the middle rather than being comfortably outside it. Unmakeable Love, then, speaks to this promise of embodied experience in installation art. It appeals to multiple senses, it allows us to physically navigate through the work to an extent, but at the same time, it exploits the work's multisensory appeal in order to reduce the viewer to another searcher, trapped in the endless search for a mythical exit, which is how I always feel when I'm reading The Lost Ones. Okay, so I think some of these issues, and this is my final example, are complicated in what must be the most monumental piece of Beckett-related installation art to date, Bauca's How It Is. This consists of a very large steel box, which is positioned at the bottom of the turbine hall ramp in Tate Modern, and only partly visible from the entrance. When visitors have walked the length of the hall, it's possible to approach the open side of the box, which you see here, and which forms a second, smaller ramp. The interior of the box is extremely dark. It's positioned away from the entrance to the gallery. To enter the box via the ramp is first of all to enter into a space of almost total darkness, which can only be explored by touch. So it takes me back to that problematics of touch and materiality that I began with. Once again then, there's a really complex dilemma of knowledge and sensation which arises in this installation work, and which is subsequently modified when the viewer's sight adjusts to the interior conditions in the box. So this is another take on the problem of embodiment and the promise of embodiment, which I think installation art makes, and on which Claire Bishop places such emphasis. To enter into the installation is to explore the very materiality which features so prominently in Egoyan's Beckett-related work and in Krapp's last tape itself. And yet that encounter is ever more mediated. How it is actually has a virtual aspect as well as the physical installation, which complicates things further. And this sense of mediation upon mediation, I think, draws attention to what Pierre Nora calls the prosthetic aspect of memory, or prosthetic memory. Now, I'm unable to offer a conclusion to this paper, but I'm just going to air the final unresolved question that arises out of it for me, and that's of the status of this idea of prosthetic memory in Beckett and for Beckett's work. Although the encounter with materiality in the memorial technologies of Krapp, or equally of Egoyan Steenbeckett, is ever more mediated, the Beckett-related installation work, which is now so prominent, as we've seen today, promises to bring about a renewal of touch. What is the status of that renewal? If you can help me answer this question, I'll be very grateful. What is the status of the renewal of touch which is suggested there? And does it, I wonder, renew what Egoyan refers to as the biblical attachment to an entire form of communication whose passing is lamented? I'll leave open the question of whether that promise is fulfilled or ultimately frustrated, and perhaps, in fact, used in order to accentuate and emphasise the kind of alienation that's brought about by recording technologies in Beckett and Egoyan and elsewhere.